Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Chantel and today I'm going to talk a little bit about, I guess I'm just going to do a little ramble about some trends that I've noticed in some of the books I've been trying to read lately, and some of my sort of thoughts and preferences, especially around like point of view and tense usage in fiction, and some of the feelings that I've been having recently about that idea, or about those usages by different authors. And I guess what I mean by that is, I this week I started reading Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. If I'm saying that wrong, I'm very, very sorry. I will put the author's name spelled correctly up on the screen. This came, pretty highly recommended as, it's YA fantasy, but supposedly it's quite dark. It's based on sort of West African mythology and history, and it's about like rebellions and magic and people being oppressed by governments and stuff that is all very appealing to me. It is, however, YA. And as I was reading, I was actually listening to the audiobook, which, again, the audiobook specifically came very highly recommended. And I ended up DNFing it at about, I don't know, a third of the way through or so, for a couple of reasons. And I just want to sort of talk about those and extrapolate them to sort of larger trends and sort of my broader preferences in fiction, just because I think it's potentially an interesting topic. So, like, first of all, and I think foremost in this, is that it is, in fact, a YA, and I am, sort of gradually coming to the acceptance of and understanding that I'm no longer the target audience for YA, if I ever was, and that therefore YA is mostly something that I should probably be avoiding when I'm picking out things to read, even if they otherwise seem quite interesting on paper. Most YA is probably not going to work for me anymore, particularly YA that has these elements of romance and romance subplots in them, particularly in this sort of post-Reylo world. And what I mean by Reylo, of course, is that Reylo is the ship name for Rey and Kylo Ren from the Star Wars sequel films that became very popular as a ship in the wake of the release of The Last Jedi in 2017, and there was a lot of fan fiction about it, and a number of those writers of fan fiction did as fanfiction writers sometimes do. They scraped the serial numbers off, changed the names of the characters, and were able to get their fanfictions published as traditionally published sort of YA enemies to lovers romances. And so now enemies to lovers romance is like super popular, particularly in the YA space, particularly in the romantasy space. And so a lot of YA fantasy stories like Children of Blood and Bone are like incorporating a pretty bog standard kind of enemies to lovers, quote unquote, tropey romance into their storylines. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not bagging on that. I'm not saying that that's a problem. And I'm certainly not saying that like what teenage girls are reading is somehow like bad, or that they're weird for liking it or anything like that. I think it's very easy to bag on teenage girls for the things that they like, and it happens every generation, and it's something that I want to try to avoid. I think whatever teenage girls like is whatever they like, and that's fine. They're allowed to like things. They're allowed to be fangirls. They're allowed to enjoy their tropey romances. It's perfectly fine. However, I am not a teenage girl, and that does not appeal to me. That sort of tropey enemies to lovers thing just doesn't work for me usually, and it usually is not going to work for me, especially in the context of a young adult novel that is written for a teenage audience, that features primarily teenage or early 20s type characters that are quite young, and that the writing is, for obvious reasons, not at a particularly high literary level, because it's not aimed at a particularly high, at a particularly mature audience. And I'm just not into that. It's just not for me. Which is fine. Again, I'm not saying anything against YA as, a concept. I'm glad that lots of YA exists and is very popular. I think the kids need to have stuff that appeals to them and that they can read and enjoy, because I think that's how you make lifelong readers, is you find the things that they enjoy at the age that they're at, you meet them where they're at, and you figure out what they like, and then they are into that, and then they will continue to read throughout their lives, right? So that's great. I think it's great. It's just not for me personally. Also, I think a problem that I had, and this is what I'm going to really extrapolate into more of a discussion, is Children of Blood and Bone is written in first person present tense. Or at least large parts of it are. And I have to admit, I am pretty persnickety about first person present tense. I don't usually like it in published fiction. I'm okay with it in fan fiction. Fan fiction is a totally different animal, for me at least, from published fiction. If I'm reading it in published fiction, I feel like there needs to be a very, very, very good reason for it, and I rarely come across a book written in first person present tense that actually provides me with a really good reason for it. The only reason that I can usually think of for writing in first person present tense is this idea that, like, doing that will somehow put the reader into a more immediate feeling, or give a feeling of more immediacy to the reader. And I don't think that's a good enough reason, because you can do that with third person past tense. You just have to work at it a little more, right? So, like, look, I hate to toot the horn of the usual suspects, but A Song of Ice and Fire is written entirely in third person past tense. It's limited POV. Every chapter is a different character's specific limited POV, but it is still in third person past tense. And I don't think anybody can deny that every single character POV in these books is very immediate. It feels very immediate, and it really, like, George R.R. Martin is extremely good at putting the reader into the perspective of his POV characters, right? Regardless of which ones they are, and regardless of which ones you like better than others, right? Whether you're reading a Tyrion chapter, or a Catelyn chapter, or a Jon Snow chapter, or an Arya or a Sansa chapter, like, they're all really, really good. And even, like, in the later books, especially, like, when we get into Cersei's chapters, Cersei is a character that everybody loves to hate, right? But, like, when we get into her chapters, you really come to understand her perspective on what's going on in a really immediate and intimate way. But it's not first person, right? It's fully all third person past tense, but it's a very limited POV, and George R.R. Martin is extremely good at it. So, like, you don't need to do first person present tense to make your characters feel real, or to put your reader into their shoes in a way, or to force empathy, or to force sympathy for the characters. You don't have to do that. It's not necessary. And I haven't really come up with any good reasons why first person present tense would be necessary, frankly. I think if you're a good enough writer, you should be able to do third person past tense, right? And even just first person on its own, I think it works best when there's a good reason for it, right? So, like, some of my favorite first books that are written in first person, For instance, you know, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, this is really obviously a book that is written as a kind of fictionalized memoir, right? Same with Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, right? This is very much a story where the main character is very explicitly telling you, the reader, their own story. In fact, Jane often addresses her reader directly in the course of this novel, and does asides and is going to explain things about, you know, how her viewpoint has changed in the years since this has happened. She's obviously, like, it's clearly, like, as a POV character, she's clearly telling her story from a distance of a certain amount of time, right? And so she's going to occasionally intervene and say, reader, let me explain something to you about what's going on here before I continue with my sort of chronological narrative, right? And it works very well. To use more modern examples, obviously a very similar thing is happening in the Farseer trilogy with Fitz as a POV character, right? And he even prefaces every chapter, and it's clear that like the beginnings of the chapter where he talks about, he sort of contextualizes the history and culture and things, and legends of this world, is clearly, like, even those little bits are clearly written by Fitz himself, and like this is clearly Fitz writing his own sort of memoirs in a way, and it works really well as such, right? But that's what first person past tense can do for you, is it can give you lots of interesting nuance and layers to your kind of storytelling that I think are lacking when you're writing first person present tense. Again, I have a hard time grasping the reasoning behind first person present tense. So yeah, and you know, if you're really good, you can do something like what N.K. Jemisin does with the Broken Earth trilogy and write largely second person, which is extremely rare. And when I first started reading that trilogy, I found it a little bit off-putting and a little bit disconcerting to be reading it in second person. But of course, some of that is kind of the point, isn't it? A lot of the Broken Earth trilogy is intended to be disconcerting, is intended to be kind of off-putting. And N.K. Jemisin clearly has a very strong grasp of the English language, and you know, she's a very skilled writer, and she knows exactly what she's doing. And so she's able to make the second person POV work very well for her in that trilogy. And it's part of what makes that trilogy so memorable and so unique, right? But of course, if you're going to do that, you have to really, really know what you're doing. And I think that's kind of similar with first person present tense. I feel like first person present tense is becoming much, much more popular. But that means, to me, it's becoming more and more difficult for me to get into these stories, because I don't find it just doesn't work for me very well, very often. It would take a very skilled hand, I think, for me to really, I would either the story would have to be so good otherwise that I would just kind of forget that it's in first person present tense, or there would have to be like just a very, very good, clearly sort of articulated reasoning for it. For instance, I did start reading, this might seem hypocritical of me, because I did start reading immediately after I DNF'd Children of Blood and Bone. I started reading or listening to Starling House by Alex E. Harrow, which is also primarily in first person present tense, but she's doing interesting things with it in the context of the book. There are actually footnotes in Starling House that are clearly from another perspective. I don't know whose perspective it is, if it is another character's perspective, or if it's just a more omniscient third person POV. But the footnotes, like, contextualize things, explain things, even occasionally call out the narrator when she's not telling the whole truth, which reminds us that this narrator is like a person with biases, and she's an unreliable narrator. So I'm finding that much more interesting, like artistically, in the context of that novel, than I was finding what Children of Blood and Bone was doing, which I did not find particularly interesting in the context of that story. So that is to say, anything can work for me potentially, but some things, sometimes for me, authors need to work harder to make those certain things work for me. And that includes the first person present tense. It also largely includes like this, again, the enemies to lovers tropey romance thing, where like it's got to hit me just the right way. It's got to be written in just in a really specific way, and it's got to be a lot more grown up than it was panning out to be in Children of Blood and Bone. Anyway, I guess that's my little rant on, I guess, YA stuff, enemies to lovers tropes, and people are free to flame me in the comments, I guess, if you want. And of course, POVs and tense usage in books. I guess if you have any thoughts or opinions, or if you want to argue with me about any of these things in the comments, feel free. I don't care. Go ahead. Argue with me all you want. Have you read any really good books that are in first person present tense? I want to know, because again, I'm not opposed to reading. I try not to be opposed to reading most things on principle. So, you know, if you've got a book that you found really good and really memorable that was written in first person present tense, let me know in the comments. I want to hear about it. Any other thoughts on, I don't know, George R. R. Martin or Robin Hobb or the Brontes or Dickens or anything like that? Just let me know. And if you want to like, subscribe, or any of that other stuff, sure, you can if you want. I'm not here to pressure you. Yeah, we'll see you in the next video. Hopefully the next one will be a ginormous book haul. I'm still waiting on a bunch of books to come in the mail, so I'm like trying to wait until all of those books get here so that I can do just one big haul video. So yeah, regardless, we'll see you in the next one. Bye.